Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. It's Dan Meehan, President and CEO of the Missouri Chamber, and I'd like to welcome you to our supply chain webinar. As I mentioned a minute ago or so, we've got about 200 folks on this program, and we're very excited to present this to you and talk about the management of our supply chain, which is so vitally important to Missouri and especially to our future as we contemplate the reshoring of the supply chain. I want to thank our staff for using my high school yearbook picture. No, I'm kidding. Obviously, they don't have me live because I have a face built for radio, but we're happy to have you all here. The events that have unfolded are far from what any of us had hoped or dreamed for, but they do give an opportunity to consider what steps we need to do to safeguard our supply chain and reimagine it really for the state of Missouri and for the Midwest in general. No reason we can't be a leader in that. We're very fortunate to have three experts with us today to discuss this. We have Eric Hansen, Vice President of Sales and Marketing with Kansas City Southern. Thanks for being here, Eric, and we're very proud to have your company represented on our executive committee on our board. Adam Hill, the President and COO with the Scarborough group of companies, and an old friend in Chris Gutierrez, President of KC Smartport Incorporated. Wanted to highlight some of the resources that we've put together for folks during the last couple months to help deal with the COVID-19 situation and to restart the economy. First and foremost, we have a Missouri Chamber Return to Work Guide, which includes best practices for companies to implement during this time. That's available at mochamber.com/return to work. In addition, we've released a plan that we call Uniting for Recovery, a COVID-19 economic response agenda, with policies that Missouri should pursue to hopefully maximize our recovery from this crisis, and encourage you to download that plan at the same site, mochamber.com/recovery, and help us get some of these things adopted by the state. We've also conducted several webinars like this one today, and we're having one this afternoon on a federal legislative update that focuses on the tax implications that we're seeing right now from all the goings on with COVID and what's being contemplated at the federal level. Finally, we know that a lot of businesses, especially those in manufacturing, are concerned about liability issues created by the COVID crisis. We are leading the charge to try to bring protection to employers from opportunistic lawsuits that might arise when people try to reopen, especially when they've done the right thing and trying to ensure the safety of their workplace or their showroom or whatever it may be for their employees and for their customers. We have asked Governor Mike Parson, to call a special session which calls the legislators back to Jefferson City to give employers a temporary safe harbor from these lawsuits. You can learn more and sign on to our letter. We have over 550 people signed on so far at mochamber.com/stop-COVID-lawsuits. We see this as very critical, and surveys we see from around the country are showing that a lot of employers, smaller employers, are very concerned about reopening because of this threat. But right now, let's get into talking about the supply chain. And first, I'd like to introduce Brian Kraus, who leads the Missouri Chamber's Manufacturing Alliance, a relatively new initiative we started in 2020. Brian will introduce our speakers and moderate today's webinar, and we hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much for being aboard. Brian, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to moderate today's discussion on supply chain disruption. As we get started, I'd like to frame the point that we are today. As everybody knows, COVID swept across Asia and Southeast Asia, moving into Europe and then over to the US. And what that did to manufacturing, production, and supply chains, we've all seen the headlines. Rail traffic down, what is the outlook for shipping and transit, what are manufacturers doing, And so there's no short of thought and idea on where we're going to head out of COVID, and what that time frame looks like is really uncertain. The World Trade Organization recently released a projection, and I'd like to forward the slide if we could. And it showed the trend line before COVID-19, as well as the trend line that we had during the recession back in 2008, 2009. And as you can see, we were on a very good trajectory globally on trade volume. However, when global pandemic hit in earlier this year, that changed everything on their trajectory. And right now, the World Trade Organization puts it at two potential paths: an optimistic path and a pessimistic scenario. And in green, you see the optimistic path, which is a quick rebound in 2020 later in the year, and then trending along the same pathway that we were pre-COVID. The other path, which is a pessimistic view, shows us really not rebounding until 2021, possibly even 2022, and that path will stay right under where that trend line was. So it's really an uncertain time for what our trade volume will look like globally. When we look at Missouri manufacturing, and pre-COVID, we had some really impressive numbers as a state on what our manufacturers producing. If we could forward that slide. Our output was really solid. Our exporting was good. We saw the lion's share was with small business and medium businesses exporting out of the state. Of course, our strongest trade partners being in Canada and Mexico. During COVID, when it first launched, we started to call our members, specifically our manufacturing and our production companies around the state. And as you probably witnessed firsthand, as a manufacturer, it was all over the map. We had some manufacturers that had totally shut their office down and their plant facilities for a limited time or even extended time period, like the automotive industry for the most part. But then we also heard from some in the packaging supply and the food chain that they were upwards of 200% in output. So a very different, depiction. So that kind of frames where we are today. And it's a pleasure to have these three industry leaders and experts in the supply chain field. Their role and their organization play at the nexus of Missouri's transportation logistics. And I'd like to introduce them real quick. Adam Hill is with us. He's the President and Chief Operating Officer for the Scarborough Group of Companies. He is a licensed customs broker, a certified customs specialist, and a certified export specialist. Adam is currently the President of KC Heartland CSCMP Roundtable and sits on the Board of Directors for the North American Strategy for Competitiveness. Also with us is Eric Hansen. He is the Vice President of Sales and Marketing, who leads the intermodal business unit in the US and Mexico for Kansas City Southern. Eric also serves on the Board of Directors for KC Smart Part, a nonprofit economic development organization for the Kansas City region. He is also on the Board of Council Supply Chain Management Professionals. Chris Gutierrez is the President of Kansas City Smart Port Incorporated. He is a nonprofit economic development organization that works to attract freight-based companies such as manufacturing, distribution, and warehouse to the 18-county bi-state Kansas City region. He is also the board member of several organizations, including the University of Kansas Supply Chain Management Program, Mid-America District Export Council, World Trade Center Kansas City, and People to People International. Good morning, gentlemen. It's great to have you here. If we could kind of start off, Eric, if you could just give us an overview of your role in Kansas City Southern.
I certainly can. As Brian just mentioned, I'm the Vice President for Intermodal Sales and Marketing here at Kansas City Southern. Kansas City Southern is one of the U.S. Class 1 railroads, as I'm sure you're aware, with a rail line that extends essentially from East St. Louis in Illinois over Kansas City down through the heartland of the United States, through Shreveport, Louisiana, going down to the border with Mexico and crossing the border at Laredo, Texas, into Mexico, through the heartland of Mexico and all the way down to the Pacific port of Lázaro Cárdenas. The business distribution, if you will, shows very clearly that we have 50% of our business in Mexico and 50% in the US, on almost every parameter that you can think of, whether it's rail, line miles, whether it's employees, revenues, anything you can think of, it's a 50-50 split. I should also say that we, through our connection to Mexico and our presence in Mexico, we're also acting as a big interchange partner for the other US Class 1 railroads. And overall, when you look at our rail volume, we interchange about 75–80% of our total volume across all business units with other railroads. So we're not always standing alone and originating and terminating everything. We're working with the other railroads to a significant degree. So thank you very much for having me here. I'm looking forward to this panel discussion here and hopefully getting some good questions along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Adam, if you wouldn't mind kind of giving us an overview of your role and organization.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. Thank you again for having us today. And like you said, my name's Adam Hill. I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer of the Scarborough Group of Companies. Scarborough is a full-service international freight forwarder, customs broker. We move freight not only internationally, but domestic as well, with a small asset-based fleet, non-asset-based truck brokerage division, and our newest company, which is our Scarborough warehousing division, which handles a lot of e-commerce and work like that. So thanks again, Brian, and I do definitely look forward to today's conversation.
Great. Thanks, Adam. And last but not least, Chris, if you can give us a little overview.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, and appreciate the Missouri Chamber putting this event on and joining the panel with the three of you. As was said, I'm Chris Gutierrez. I'm president of Kansas City Smartport. We're the regional economic development group for the Kansas City Metro, both Kansas and Missouri, focused specifically on freight and transportation and supply chain, but doing economic development in Missouri for a number of years, and we definitely are a transportation hub. So excited about this conversation about supply chain, and like the other panelists, look forward to the questions at the end.
Great. Thanks so much, fellas. You know, each one of you sit in a different position in your organization and see the supply chains a little bit differently. You know, what have you seen out of, you know, the recent COVID-19 in Missouri for manufacturers and, you know, producers? Adam, you know, you deal with a lot of international freight forwarding. You know, what are you seeing on that front?
So I think really, you know, to take a quick step back, we have to look, the impacts that we're feeling today really started late 2019 in Asia, right? And so as we've seen the virus make this path around the world, the supply chain follows not long thereafter. So we saw leading into a Chinese New Year and then a full shutdown of really the world's second largest economy for 6.5 or so straight weeks. And you start to look at how does that impact folks in Missouri. So if you're looking from an importing perspective, you start to see, now we're seeing those blank sailings out of China because China wasn't producing for a long time. And then because of that, you're not getting those export containers repositioned here within the Midwest or even on the coast, depending on where your manufacturing facilities actually are, to get equipment that you can then sell back internationally. And then as China starts to come back on board, right, March, April, that's really when, you know, our company, we went home St. Patrick's Day, March 17th. And we've been, except for the team that runs the warehouses day in and day out, physically moving that freight, everyone else has been home. So it's really, as we've seen China come back online, we've seen the US and Europe, to most of that extent as well, start to have stay-at-home orders, right? Start to work through some more of their issues. So really from what we've seen is this just a global trail of, as the virus has moved across the globe, the supply chain effects have as well. And so now we have China producing basically back at the rate they were, but we have Europe and we have North America not consuming at that same rate. So we're seeing those backlogs start to hit Chinese ports, and then you still see some of those blank sailings as carriers look to continually or attempt to stay profitable for the 2020 contract season. And because of that, you're seeing a lot of movement in rates. You're seeing an increase in rates across the board. And so I think headed into this year, we're really, from an international perspective, June is going to be, in my opinion, kind of a bellwether for how the rest of this year goes. If we're seeing some more bookings, we're seeing consumption, it seems like, start to pick up, and we tend to be somewhat on the leading edge of that, and just because of how long the whole supply chain actually is. And so we're somewhat confident headed into June to see how consumption rises, but I definitely think that these impacts are going to be felt through the end of this year as the supply chain continues to right size itself and rebalance itself from how off balance we've been, really starting come February.
Yeah, and at one point, Eric, Adam, you described it when we were on a call as kind of a whip. As you see a whip kind of move through, it has peaks and valleys to it before it actually flattens out and everything's stable. And that kind of is what we may experience. Eric, you're dealing with North American trade going through Latin America as well as Canada. And primarily with large raw goods. Were you seeing the same type of disruptions across the rail lines?
We definitely were, and if you look at it, we actually started seeing the impact in the middle of March, based on two big factors. One was the extended shutdown in China. You had the Chinese New Year, and then you combine that with the virus wreaking havoc in the manufacturing space over there. And as that started to trigger blank sailings, as Adam was also referring to, we saw a reduced flow of goods coming into both the US, but more notably for us, into Mexico. And that had a significant impact. Combining that then with the middle of March showing the US particularly shutting down many of the manufacturing plants and facilities around the country to try and defeat the virus and work through the pandemic. And that reduced demand here. And we saw the same in Mexico, especially with the automotive manufacturers shutting down, had a big impact. There is a significant funnel of freight that moves on the railroad, not only the final product, the finished vehicles moving on the railroad, but also you have metals, you have plastics, and other parts that are going into the manufacturing process that are actually moving on rail. So we saw that drop off significantly as well. So if you look at the railroads overall, you showed it on your first slide, Brian, 20% reduction as the COVID pandemic really hit the industries here across the rail network. We've actually seen the second quarter, April and May, being hit fairly hard, with about 25% reduction in our total volume so far this month, this quarter. But we're also seeing, as Adam referred to, a little bit of a turnaround here in June as the economies are starting to open again. Automotive plants are back in not full swing because demand is still low and they're still managing through precautions to protect their workforce. But we are seeing some ramp up of volume in and out of manufacturing plants. I do want to mention that if there's one bright spot, it's been food products in general, as well as all the cleaning products and everything else that people needed through this period. They've continued moving. A lot of that is moving on rail as well. And one bright spot for us has been Mondelez, in particular in Mexico, a plant very close to one of our intermodal ramps down there in Monterrey, which has continued shipping stable volumes. They have been producing full speed through this shutdown period. So the Oreo supply in the US is safe for now, it seems. But, yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. My sons will very much enjoy that, as many on this call will. And that was one thing that we also heard from were the food production companies and those that support them with packaging. Their business in the beginning of COVID was actually increasing considerably. Now we're seeing, of course, with stories coming out like St. Joseph, Missouri, and other areas of the state and around the country that their production plants are being impacted by, the COVID coming in. Chris, I'd like to turn it over to you. You sit at the nexus of Kansas City multimodal supply chain. And what have you been seeing just specific to that region?
Yeah, Brian, COVID absolutely affected the economy in many sectors. And like the two speakers said, mid-March, we went home as well and functioned remotely still today. But there's been pieces of the economy and the industrial real estate sector that has grown, specifically e-commerce. As we all sit at home and felt more comfortable ordering online, we've seen growth in e-commerce activity, both projects that we had before COVID, as well as projects that were created as these companies realized that their supply chain network needed to be more robust and they needed more facilities. So we've seen a growth in that. And as Eric highlighted, food production has both been challenged as well as grown during this and changed during this situation because the purchasing of food has changed, which made the companies, manufacturers and distribution companies adapt to that. You've had the St. Joe and other meat production plants been challenged with this, and they've had to readapt and change the way they move their freight as well as production. So there's been some growth areas in food and e-commerce. Eric mentioned the automotive industry. That's a significant industry for Missouri. That's challenged us as it was shut down for a while, and good to see it's back up. I personally, my family's bought 2 cars during COVID, so we've done our part to keep the railroad moving. And I think you're going to see industrial real estate come out pretty fast in the 3rd and 4th quarter as that demand is still there. So it's been a little bit of a mixed bag, but from an economic development standpoint, we've been very busy during this crisis as companies are looking to expand or grow their supply chain network.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, Chris. We had heard from a couple other entities in the state that are economic development organizations that they too also saw continuation of their client projects and even some new projects take shape over the time of COVID. So, that's a good indicator that we still kind of persisted through it, even though everything was disrupted. So that's good that Kansas City's moving forward as well. As you've kind of dealt with different issues in your supply chains, what are you seeing manufacturers do to kind of shift their supply chains? Are you seeing them drop down into second tiers, or are they realigning their tier structure on their suppliers? What do you kind of get a sense of? And this for anybody that wants to take it.
Go ahead.
I think you're seeing companies really look at their supply chain network and to make sure it's optimized for today's environment, whether that's shifting production locations or expanding distribution. And the other thing is looking at safety stock. And we talked yesterday that a lot of companies were just in time, and they've really had to embrace an inventory level that is there for emergencies or for disruptions like this. We've seen real estate studies that could be an additional 1 billion square foot of new space just to handle that safety stock or inventory to cover those disruptions. So that's been a big change. I think companies, both manufacturers and distribution companies, have implemented or starting to implement now.
Yeah, I would add to that. Sorry, Adam. I would add to that changing your supply chains and shifting them around, that's something that typically takes time. Adding to buffer stock or safety stock is probably the first and easiest step, if you have the warehouse space, that is. But shifting around and sourcing differently is also what many manufacturers and importers in particular are looking at. Now, when we look at this in the long term, we've actually seen that start a couple of years ago with the China trade war and people moving out and finding a greater degree of diversification in their supply chains and sourcing from different countries. That showed itself really in 2019, where China's share of imports into the US dropped. And Vietnam and Malaysia, for example, increased their share of the imports into the United States quite dramatically. So we're seeing that shift, and that will most likely continue. And I think it'll continue for the long term. It's not something that happens overnight. But what we have heard from several manufacturers, whether it's in the automotive industry or elsewhere, is that they're looking at the safety stock. They're looking at where they source from. Nearshoring, onshoring is definitely on the agenda, but more so is supply chain diversification, not relying on one single source and one single location, but spreading out both your sourcing as well as your inventories so that you have access to them.
Well, and I think one thing, I think, Eric, you nailed it. As we've seen these people really start to spread, we've seen Mexico take a little bit of that business. But one thing that we always caution is, as you start to diversify that supply base, is, are you truly diversifying your supply base? Are you just adding a middleman from, we hear this phrase, decoupling from China. And we hear this idea that, oh, well, instead of sourcing from, a shop in Shanghai, I'm going to start sourcing from a shop in Monterrey, Mexico. Well, you then need to check with your shop in Monterrey, Mexico to make sure that they're not still getting their raw material from a potentially same shop in Shanghai, right? So, and I feel like we're really getting to a spot where just knowing your supplier isn't good enough anymore, right? For the longest time, as long as you bought from whoever you needed to buy from, you were comfortable. But now you need to understand where's their supply base coming from. And the automotive industry has done it well with their tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. They really understand that. But for the most part, the rest of the industries really haven't caught up to that type of intricate knowledge about how does your supply chain actually function. And I think we're going to see more and more people really start to get into that in the coming year or two.
Yeah, and that puts Missouri in a really good light, in many regards, being pretty much 8 hours across the border from any major metropolitan city in the Midwest, as well as the multimodal hubs that we have, both rail, water, road, and air. I mean, we really can play a vital role, especially if our manufacturers have their names out there and can get into some of those supply chains on the East and West Coast. We could produce some really good products that could get into there, could get out there. So I think Missouri, has a key point to play going forward. And it sounds like, what kind of Chris had mentioned, there's room for growth and opportunity there in Kansas City as a hub, as well as in St. Louis. So, outside of that, restructuring their tiers, any other weaknesses that you kind of see with the supply chains at this point?
I think stocking levels have still been an issue. We talked yesterday about when we had the big West Coast port strike, right? And we got a lot of phone calls about conversations around the idea of what is our plan. And my first question in response to that was, how much inventory do you have? Because if you don't have enough to absorb a change in routing, a change in supply base, the plan doesn't matter, because you're going to run out of inventory before the plan can take into place. And so, I think Chris nailed it. As these things continue to grow, we're going to see more of that, maybe just in time from a local warehouse, but you're importing some level of safety stock, or manufacturing and holding some level of safety stock off-site just in case. That to me is still going to be definitely key as we move forward. And, inventory, obviously there's a carrying cost to that. So there's definitely a weight on both sides of this equation, but I think maybe right now we might start leaning a little bit more towards it's okay to carry just a little bit more inventory.
And if I can add to that, sorry, Chris, I could see you starting there. If I can add to that, so aside from moving from just in time to just in case, which I don't want to I don't want to create a new term here, but that seems to be what people are thinking about. How do we prepare ourselves for further disruption down the road, and is that likely, and what will we do then? That's one thing. The other disruption that we've actually heard about more than we've seen it ourselves in our flows has been equipment imbalances. As you see, especially the international container flows, right? If you see containers coming in to the West Coast drop with 20 or 30%, then those containers that you're missing won't be available for the exports either. And Adam was alluding to that in his first introduction as well. When we look at the Midwest and we look at some of the export commodities that are relying on an inbound flow of containers and that being available here, that has been a constraint, and finding those containers has actually, for certain periods of time, been a constraint. And then getting them back when you don't have those sailings coming in with the capacity, actually getting them loaded back out and going back to Asia, where much of that ends up in the ag business, for example, has been a challenge as well. So as soon as there is a disruption to the flow of goods, then you start jumping around trying to find out, what do I do to safeguard my supply chains? But the upheaval that is created is broad and deep as well. It actually impacts a lot of different factors in your supply chains. It's not just, hey, we have less inventory or we have no access to capacity. It's the imbalances as well.
You know, Brian, the thing I would add, a weakness or a challenge that we had pre-COVID, the beginning of the year, was around workforce. And, you know, we had record unemployment levels, and manufacturers on this call were challenged to find people to fill open positions. You put that in today's environment, we have unemployment rates pushing double digits now, and you think that'd be a relief, but it's really not. It's those workers now rethinking what they want to do, whether they came out of the restaurant and hospitality industry or the retail industry, or they were furloughed and laid off at different facilities. We need to really grab them and get them focused on the right skill sets and the career opportunities that are out there. And a lot of companies are rethinking how they do their manufacturing and what those employment base is and could be. I think that's going to be a tremendous challenge and disruption moving forward. And again, Missouri's done a lot to focus on workforce development. I think that's going to be key for us to stay competitive as the economy comes back to the next normal, as they're calling it.
Yeah, you know, you hit on a really good point there, Chris. When we look about workforce, I mean, it was a very dire situation pre-COVID. Manufacturers couldn't find anybody in, you know, entry-level positions and even the mid-skill technical positions that they so desperately need. And so, you know, the one lucky thing I think we had going into pre-COVID as a state was we have a governor that's dedicated to workforce and infrastructure, and that's one key piece. And because of that, there's also been a realignment of the Department of Higher Education with the Division of Workforce Development. And now we have a very streamlined effort by both the 4-year, 2-year and state technical college, as well as the workforce centers, to really hone in on, you know, those employees that could potentially transition into short-term training opportunities that could go into manufacturing, but also supply chain logistics and working in freight carriers and warehouse distribution centers. So we have a good asset pool kind of in place when you look at the team that's leading in Jefferson City on workforce development. So, you know, coming out of this, I hope that, you know, we're able to transition a lot of these retail service folks. You know, the jobs may not be back for them right away, and they may be able to find some other opportunities out there.
I agree. We've got to be very careful not to poach. All of the industries need to be able to handle their workforce, but as you said, every industry is changing, and maybe the workforce skills, the workforce numbers are going to change, and we need to be able to quickly respond to that, as opposed to looking at one to poach workers back and forth. We don't want that to happen.
So, you know, going into, you know, a new world with post-COVID, almost post-COVID, we're not out of the woods yet, and we don't have a vaccine in place. But what do you think are, Eric, you kind of hit on this a little bit. There's a lot of opportunity with North America, specifically with Mexico and Canada. Are you going to see some restructuring in the supply chain through that?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing and hearing is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, changing your sourcing and switching supply chains or shifting supply chains is something that takes time. It's not something you do overnight. But I would say that for the last 25 years, since NAFTA was really introduced, we have seen a near-sourcing trend with a lot more manufacturing taking place in Mexico for the U.S. market, including the Midwest. And I think this particular situation may be a trigger to accelerate that. And that's my own opinion. I think that people will look very carefully and at the opportunities presented by Mexico as a near sourcing, low cost manufacturing area with plenty of skilled labor. And I think that that will bode well for our business, at least, serving Mexico. And I think it will help the supply chain diversification as well. Both shortening supply chains overall, being less reliant on the very long supply chains from China and the rest of Asia, but also diversifying and putting things closer to where you actually need the goods will help with the safety stock and managing the levels of safety stock that is necessary. So I think there are some opportunities here, including in the United States, obviously. Chris was mentioning before that warehousing space is still, or industrial real estate is still doing really well. And people are looking at how they can better serve the communities that they need to serve and deliver to without having empty shelves, which is what nobody wants to see. So yeah, I think we see opportunities out there.
Yeah, if we all had a crystal ball and could have invested in Charmin before this all began, or Clorox, we'd be coming out of this pretty good. But it's kind of interesting how that that disruption really impacted people's mindset going into the COVID, and now we're seeing some food disruptions a little bit with everything. But yeah, Chris, you kind of sit at that nexus of seeing the overview of Kansas City. You mentioned it earlier about the warehousing. Adam kind of touched on it. Do you feel like there's enough warehousing space and capacity in Kansas City? And if not, what can we do to maybe improve that for manufacturers, producers?
I think both sides of the state saw construction continue during COVID. Building of new buildings was an essential industry. So here in Kansas City specifically, we saw a number of new industrial spec developments happening. But I don't think there's enough. I think as we talked about, 1 billion square feet of new space for safety stock, e-commerce growth, we need to continue that. And getting those of you on the call across the state, getting vertical ready sites ready to go or a building started, because the time frame for decisions to pick that new building is going to be even shorter now coming out of this situation. You need to have product ready. I also think the competitive position of foreign trade zones for the imported products is a big step. In Kansas City and St. Louis, we both have foreign trade zones. Specifically here, aggressive growth in terms of getting companies activated in their zones and making sure they understand the value proposition of what a foreign trade zone will do for them. And then lastly, Brian, I think you're going to see more companies and regions look at automation and how automation can make the facilities more efficient, more productive, but also understand the social distancing. You don't necessarily have to have 6 feet between two robots. How that's going to respond, how the workforce could be complemented with robotics and automation systems. I think all of that is going to continue to make Kansas City and Missouri as a whole in the Midwest competitive for this growth, because I think this is where the economy is really going to see the best impact and positive growth moving forward.
Yeah, you hit on a good point about automation, and that's something we really haven't touched on. But as we have autonomous vehicles coming into the marketplace and trucking, that's going to help ease some of the disruptions that COVID may bring, or another pandemic in the future. I don't know, Adam, did you see a lot of, a lot of the trucking industry hit by COVID? I mean, that wasn't really a big news story overall compared to some of the other, aspects.
The trucking industry itself and the surface transportation just in general has it faced a lot of pricing pressure, but one of the interesting things is usually when you see pricing pressure, you see loads available for longer, meaning that carriers are willing to turn down that because there may be something better paying coming behind it. And what we saw in this market, which was a little bit more interesting, is we saw this massive pricing pressure hit, and carriers were still accepting those loads and accepting those lower margins and accepting freight to move at a loss. And I think you're going to see, I don't think we've seen the fallout on the domestic transportation side yet that we're going to see. I think you're going to see people who have tried to scrape by over the last few months. We've even had some local news stories about issues with different debt covenants and things like that, and starting to get us into a position where, are we going to lose a trucking company or two? We had a really big bankruptcy a year or so ago with Celadon, and how does that start to impact farther down the supply chain? And I think that's where you start to look at more, you look to guys like Eric and say, hey, I don't have the capacity, but if you can move my truckload from Kansas City to Mexico City, and then all I have to do is get a local driver now to move it to final destination, that's a different model than saying, let's pick it up and let's move it. Obviously there's different transit times, there's different coordinations. And as Eric's alluded to multiple times, these things take time, right? And so, but I really don't think we're going to see the domestic fallout for another month or two as things start to pick back up. A lot of small trucking companies took advantage of, some of the small business things that were offered, but we also ran into situations where you had drivers unwilling to drive in fear for their own safety. And so, as all of this starts to come back around, I think we're going to see some more fallout here in the next 60 days to 90 days of some of these domestic companies that just couldn't quite keep up with the name of the game. Physically moving freight is a tough market in general. Margins are thin, risk and exposure is high. And so as you get farther into that, I think we're going to see something where we are going to lose a few more before everything really levels back out.
So are you anticipating, Adam, a pretty good sized surge here as we go into the end of month of June and July? Do you expect a pretty good surge?
Right now we're kind of in produce season, or at least parts of produce season, which always kind of ups the amount of cargo moving. But that surge really comes from consumer consumption, right? And so as consumer consumption continues to grow, you're going to see it, because a lot of those items may not be retail ready yet. And so if it's not retail ready, we're not going to see that quick surge to say, let's get it back on the shelf because our shelf is empty. It still needs to move through its process before it, in theory, would become retail ready. And so I don't think we're going to see this massive surge. Do I think we're going to see an uptick? Absolutely. And I think we're going to see it through the end of the year. But I don't think someone's going to wake up tomorrow and we're going to be up 60% overnight and then have capacity crunches and kind of going the other way on the pricing pressure, right? So I don't anticipate that, at least in the near term.
Oh, I would agree with that. Seen from our perspective, the railroads were all along considered essential industry in both the US and Mexico. So we've continued operating and have actually not been affected in terms of productivity or access to capacity or people and yards and what have you. We've not been affected in that space at all during this pandemic. What we did hear, especially in the initial stages of the virus spreading out in the US, we did hear that some truck drivers found it difficult to get into rest areas that were shut off to people from certain states and without protective gear and all of those things. So it kind of went out of control a little bit, but it seems to be that it lasted for a very short period of time. these truck drivers found different outlets, different areas to rest in. Many of those rest areas and truck stops opened up again fairly quickly again, said, hey, we just need to take your temperature and then you're fine, right? You can come in and get your meal. So I think people are learning to live with this, and the COVID pandemic has, while it has been impactful overall, and as Adam mentioned on the truck capacity and the pricing in particular, aside from the industry shutting down and demand being lower, we haven't really seen disruption in the rail industry in terms of volume, which kind of sets the stage for a resurgence of volume coming back and the capacity still being there. We're not foreseeing any restrictions in that regard.
And, Brian, I'll add to that. There was definitely disruptions, but the railroads, the trucking companies, the parcel companies continued to deliver freight during all of this. I mean, you saw heightened recognition of the supply chain industry, from little kids drawing chalk thank yous to the UPS guy delivered to trucks in front of the White House. This industry is what makes this country grow. And again, as Eric said, they're an essential industry, and they kept moving freight during all of this. I mean, they handled the disruption and the challenges. Adam continued to move freight internationally. It is what this group does and makes your manufacturers successful in what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, great point, Chris. And, I know you can attest to this. I mean, I saw probably double, if not triple, the amount of FedEx, UPS trucks going up and down my street, dropping off packages left and right to folks. And so, the trucking industry and especially those, FedEx and UPS and US Postal did a phenomenal job of kind of keeping up with that demand, keep us kind of in the game overall. So, going forward, I'd like to, pause real quick. If you have Q&A, if you have any questions for the panelists, please put a question in the Q&A box in the lower portion of your screen. We'll go ahead and open it up here shortly. And we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, I saw some of the good feed on the chat, and it sounds very much similar to what we were discussing. How do we reshore a lot of what's been offshored to China and India and other areas out east into the U.S. and specifically domestic market here in Missouri. If you had a, kind of a, your thoughts, how do we position Missouri out of COVID, to really lead, and how can our manufacturers take advantage of, our geography?
I'll start. I think we've hit on it. We have all four modes of transportation in Missouri. We're a top state in most of those modes in terms of moving freight. I think that gives a competitive advantage for the state of Missouri. We're one of the leading foreign trade zone international freight movement, both inbound imports and exports. I think that needs to continue. I think that the thing that Missouri needs to do is tell that story in a compelling message about the advantages of the workforce, the transportation assets, the fact that we continue to build spec industrial space. All of that is an advantage to Missouri, great incentive structure. I think we need to tell that story as loud as we can. Missouri and Midwest generally are somewhat shy and beating our chest on how well we do things, but I think that's got to change. We do it in Kansas City. I don't mean to pick on the rest of the state, but we're going to continue to tell that story and stay ahead of this. And our deal flow is already showing there's interest in what we're talking about and what we do in this region. I think Missouri is going to be in a very good position coming forward into that next norm.
Well, you look at, especially, Kansas City, I mean, if you draw a line down the middle of the country, north, south, east, west, we're almost dead center. And so you start to look at, and even Missouri in general, and you start to look at how much of the U.S. population can you reach with a 2-day drive. It's massive. And so, as companies look to move to lower cost, lower cost doesn't necessarily mean another country either. And so you start to find some lower cost labor, lower cost land, and things like that in the Midwest of the U.S. And we look at these areas and say, we can service Chicago to Dallas to Laredo, Texas, all less than, a 2-day drive. And so you start to look at that and you say, one location can service a lot more than maybe one location on the West Coast or on the East Coast who takes 4 to 5 days to service the other side of the country, where we're doing it in 2 days all around. So I think Kansas City in Missouri in general is just a really good location, logistics wise. It makes a lot of sense. You just get to you access a lot of our population here in the US very quickly.
Eric, any thoughts from you on moving forward?
Yeah, I would just say that the transportation network that Chris was talking about, with all 4 modes of transportation being available and plentiful in the area, both north, south, east, west, and that's really what will also attract additional manufacturing and additional business activity to the region, I believe. Kansas City has historically been a hub for the United States. I think that in our region in particular here, and I know that you're in Jefferson and you're also speaking for the rest of Missouri, but the Kansas City, Missouri region is certainly an important hub going forward as well. I know that the railroads operating here are continuing to promote and show efficient delivery of services here. Trucking is plentiful, and you have the barge service and the airport delivering the services at a very high level as well. So I think all in all, the environment here from a transportation hub perspective is conducive to attracting additional businesses.
It didn't hurt the global attention we got from the Super Bowl champions, Kansas City Chiefs.
Not at all, not at all. And who knows, reigning champion for 2 years, depending on NFL starting back up. That's what we're saying with St. Louis Blues hockey right now, is if we could be a 2-year champion. So we'll see. Just a reminder, folks, we have some Q&A available if you'd like to open up some Q&A. We do have one question that came across right now as others are coming in. And this specific, what we kind of touched on this a little bit. What type of disruptions have you seen or do you see coming from the president as his administration moves to end some of the privileges or relationships in Hong Kong? Anybody, kind of have a pulse on that?
Well, really from a transportation perspective, Hong Kong, if we look a long time ago, Hong Kong doesn't have a lot of the manufacturing that China does in general. Most of that manufacturing moved out a long time ago, right across the border into Shenzhen. So I don't know how much from a cargo flow perspective, especially import wise, Hong Kong's not that big. Hong Kong, where I think we could start to see issues in Hong Kong is in a transshipment, because Hong Kong has some special customs rules that allows cargo to come in and out pretty freely, as long as it doesn't enter the commerce of Hong Kong. So we're going to see some issues there. And then I think we're really going to see some issues on the export side. As people were previously exporting to Hong Kong, exporting to Hong Kong and exporting to China were 2 very, very, very different things. And as we continue to move down this path, they're going to become one and the same. And once they become one and the same rules, regulations, licenses, things like that you need to export to China, we're going to now need to export to Hong Kong. And I think that's where you have some impact. And then obviously any of those international travelers out there, you need a visa to get into China. You don't necessarily need a visa to get into Hong Kong. Well, you might now. And so I think there's a lot that's getting ready to come down the line with all of this. Like I said, on an import side, I'm not overly concerned. They don't have a lot of manufacturing there. On the export side, though, there is consumption there. And so trying to figure out how does that work the best. I'll give you a great example right now. One of our partners' office in Shenzhen, one of the ladies that works there and runs the office actually lives in Hong Kong and crosses the border every day. Well, based on current Chinese rules, she's coming from another country. And so she would be forced to quarantine for 14 days just to get to the office. So the first question I asked is, well, can you go to work now? And she's like, I don't know. And so I think there's a lot that you're going to see on the ground over there that is going to be kind of interesting as how this gets positioned in the long run.
On the transshipment piece, just adding that there are several countries and ports in the Asia region that are ready and capable even of taking up a big part of that slack that Hong Kong has handled. Singapore, two ports in Malaysia. You have Indonesia probably buying for some of that. So I think the disruption will be felt, but the shift in those patterns of shipping will probably happen faster than otherwise supply chains might change. It's just a thought.
Yeah, it's an interesting time, and we also see, you kind of touched on that too, Adam. With the migration of workforce across borders, from Mexico to U.S. and Canada to U.S. So things right here in our own country are going to impact that as well. That kind of leads us into a next question we have, and we don't have a lot of time, but it really hits on the workforce component that Chris spoke of. And what kind of job opportunities do you expect, or shortages in the next couple of years brought on by COVID in your industry?
I'll jump in. I think we're already seeing and pre-COVID saw challenges in the workforce for transportation. Adam hit on it in terms of trucking shortages and other things. I mean, the rail industry as well on getting more and more workers that in the rail yards. I think that's going to continue, but I think the real focus needs to be on training those workers for the careers and skills that are needed. Excuse me. We have a tendency to train and educate based on the degree, and I think the education industry is changing to really focus to do that on the career or the job opportunity. That's got to really continue on a fast pace right now. But I think we're going to be all right. I think there's going to be that continued upskilling, because as we talked about automation and other skill sets that are going to be needed on the job site, you've got to implement that training. Adam's got a great example of Scarborough University. They are constantly training themselves and their clients on changes. Companies need to focus on that because technology is changing overnight, and you've got to be able to focus on that within your workforce. So I think it's just an attention like Missouri has put to it, and a continued focus on the industrial kind of manufacturing skill set that's needed.
Absolutely. Adam, Eric, any thoughts from you? Or
I mean, I think from our side, one of the things that at least has been kind of interesting, and as Eric alluded to, we've all been essential. And so as you start to see people move out of industries that maybe weren't, we've even seen it in a couple of the job openings that we've had. We've gotten some different applications. And so just in general, I think it's been kind of an interesting take to say our industry's never been, no one wakes up one day and says, I want to be a customs broker, I want to be a freight forwarder. You usually fall into our world. And now we're having people start to seek us out. And so, to us, it's kind of interesting that we're starting to see some of these different skill sets. And it really excites me as someone who's bringing it in, because you get new skill sets into your own place of business, you get new ideas. And as those new ideas come, the innovation starts to really grow.
Mm-hmm. And just a brief comment from me, I would say that the disruption to supply chains in general has illustrated a need for additional skill sets and higher level skill sets in the supply chain industry as a whole. And I think that through the various universities that we have in and around the region here, as well as the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals having educational programs that will help people potentially acquire those skills and enter into a supply chain management role that will be critical to plan for and manage through future disruptions to this particular industry. I think that's going to be important.
Yeah, great point, Eric. And that was a
plug, I know, but
yeah, no. Well, that was a trending occupation in Kansas City before COVID, and it certainly will be out of COVID, and same in St. Louis, Springfield, and other areas. So great points. We've hit our mark for time, and I just want to say thank you so much to Eric, Adam, and Chris for joining us today on this topic. It's one thing to kind of see the headlines. It's another thing to hear from you, experts that are actually living the moment with the COVID and supply chain logistics. So thank you all for being here. Just a quick point, we will have our recording of this posted on our website, so you can find that out afterwards. You can share that with members of your team. And then looking ahead in the next couple of weeks, we will have part 2 of our supply chain webinar series. We'll have Dr. Panos Kouvelis, who is the Executive Director for the Boeing Supply Chain Management Center at Washington University, lead a panel discussion on risk management and resiliency in supply chains for manufacturers, and we'll have some other manufacturers join Dr. Kouvelis for that one. So be on the lookout for that coming forward. And once again, there's some great resources on our webpage. Both what Dan Meehan spoke of are getting back to work and uniting Missouri post-COVID. So with that, gentlemen, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and look forward to future conversations down the road.
Thanks, Brian. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.